Octopath Traveler 0 notably derives its story from the plot of Champions of the Continent, the Octopath Traveler mobile game. Have you ever wondered just what changes were made between the games in terms of their stories? I wanted to make this video ever since I started playing 0 because I very quickly started noticing changes from the beginning and kept noticing changes up until the end of the game, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. There's some minor changes all over the place really, but I'll mainly be focusing on the bigger changes in the story, because we'd be here forever if I brought up every time a character is positioned slightly differently or uses a different word somewhere in the script. I will talk about some gameplay changes here and there though, like whenever a location is significantly altered or anything like that. Keep in mind that this video will have full game spoilers for both Octopath Traveler 0 and Champions of the Continent, so I'd highly recommend playing at least one of those two games if you haven't already. But with that out of the way, let's just get right into the video. Before talking about Champions of the Continent's main story, I actually want to mention first, if you didn't know already somehow, that the entire Wishvale storyline is new to 0. As such, anytime a character mentions Wishvale, then you can be sure that's a new line that didn't exist in the original. Similarly, the protagonist being their own character is new to this game's story, so anytime a character references something about the protagonist's parents or their desire for revenge, then that's a new scene as well. The most prominent examples of this are in the dialogues of the final bosses of the first 3 master arcs, as well as Oscar the Traitor's dialogue, in which they all reference the protagonist in the Wishvale tragedy. And just for reference, in Champions of the Continent, your main character is just whichever gacha character you set as the leader of your party, and that can include most crossover characters, so you can have 2B from Nier Automata or Cecil from Final Fantasy IV appear in cutscenes if you really want. Needless to say, the Chosen One in 0 is a much more concrete character in the story when compared to whatever was going on in the mobile game. As for the start of the plot itself in Champions of the Continent, it's much more straight and to the point than in 0. You're told about the creation of Orstera, you pull one of 8 gacha characters which you immediately start playing as, you fight a wolf that is later implied to be Elfric, sound familiar? And then Finish shows up and lets you choose if you want to start with the Wealth, Power, or Fame story first. In short, the protagonist of the mobile game doesn't really have a motive at all like 0's protagonist, they're kind of just along for the ride. One other thing I should mention before we talk about the Master Arcs here is that I didn't notice many major changes in Master of Wealth or Bestower of Wealth other than the few added lines of dialogue that reference the protagonist in Wishvale that I already mentioned, so I won't be talking much about those 2 arcs. I don't know why these 2 seem to get less changes than any other part of the game, but to be fair, there isn't much a change with either of those parts of the story anyway. So I'll start by talking about Master of Power first. So in Master of Power, the story immediately starts off different when the barkeep tells you to talk to a Scarlet Wing at the bar who turns out to be Velnort. You and Velnort rescue Rinyu from a zombified man and then go back to their house. However, in the mobile game, it plays out a bit differently. Velnort isn't introduced at the bar at all. You rescue Rinyu on your own, and Velnort only shows up after you get back to the house. It's a minor change, but I think 0 does a better job at establishing Velnort as the main character of Master of Power as opposed to Rinyu, who doesn't do as much. And I also think it does a better job at establishing their relationship. One other scene that's worth mentioning is this flashback sequence where Velnort is in jail and Tytos is blackmailing him into making the Scarlet Elixir. This is interesting because in Champions of the Continent, this scene plays pretty much right at the start of the chapter. It actually plays right after the introduction scene. But in 0, it plays more toward the end of the chapter, right before Owl the Butler shows up and that whole scene plays out. I just think it's interesting that they would move an entire scene like this. I think it does flow better this way since Velnort, Rinyu, and Tytos have all been properly introduced at this point in the plot, so I think I understand why they did it. That's the only other major change I noticed in Master of Power, by the way. I was really hoping they'd change more past Chapter 1 since Master of Power is often considered the weakest arc of the game, but oh well. Moving on to Master of Fame, I was on the fence about bringing this first change up, but I think it is worth mentioning since it made a pretty big difference to me. So Francesca's characterization seems a bit different from the way she acts in the mobile game. In Champions of the Continent, Francesca comes off as a very serious and confident character, while in 0 she's portrayed as being a bit weaker and more easily manipulated by Auguste. Just look at the differences in this scene in particular and judge for yourself.
ですが、あれほどの演者を失い続けても、あなた様にとって不利益になりかねません。
But if you continue to lose performers like this, it may reflect poorly on you. Forgive me.
In 0, she seems to show some actual fear here, as shown by her stuttering and the tone in her voice. I think it's a great change because people usually tend to express fear when their lives are threatened. I'm sorry, but she really was lacking in personality in the original story, let's be honest. In Chapter 3, there's this scene where Auguste is reenacting the poison scene with Francesca stand-in in the play. In the mobile game, the woman picks Auguste and he starts monologuing, and then the scene just kind of ends. But in Zero, he actually stabs the woman before going into the monologue. Not a major change on its own or anything, but certainly noticeable. Him being the last one standing on stage makes it feel more powerful, and I like how he brazenly depicted himself as her killer, despite not being the one to directly kill her in the previous chapter. Also, this subsequent bit where the child tries to kill him out of revenge for killing his mother but misses his heart is new to Zero as well. Maybe it's meant to be a metaphor for the protagonist? I already mentioned that references to the protagonist's desire for revenge are all new, and that does apply here as well. But I just want to say that Auguste's new explanation that Schwartz as a revenge seeker is meant to be a parallel to the protagonist who also wants revenge on Auguste after he killed their mother works so well in this story. Schwartz was already a revenge seeker in Champions of the Continent, but this new context about why he chose this persona of his to be driven by revenge ties in so well with the new Wishvale story, it's kind of amazing. Just wanted to mention that. Also, I won't bore you with all the changes made to the boss fights throughout the games and how they work, but I do think it's worth mentioning that the characters helping you in the boss battles of the first 3 arcs, those being Bargello and Master of Wealth, Velnort and Master of Power, and Schwartz and Master of Fame, are all new to Zero. The mobile game had some of these fights here and there, but they didn't start happening until Master of All Chapter 8, with Alaune helping you fight Pardis. I'm really glad they added these to Zero because it makes you feel like the story characters are actively helping you fight their battles with them, instead of just standing around off-screen somewhere while you fight some eldritch god on your own. That's actually it for changes in the initial 3 Master arcs, but believe me, the changes only get bigger from here, because now we get to talk about Sazantos. Sazantos hands down got the most changes out of any character in this game in terms of how the scenes with him play out. In Zero, you meet him in Wishvale after he rescues you from some assassins shortly before Master of All, although in the mobile game, the scene normally plays after Master of All is already over, so he's introduced much earlier in Zero. In Champions of the Continent, you first meet who you think is Sazantos and Rippletide, and you go to the Isle of Ursa together, but then it turns out that it was just Gonska the Jester disguised as Sazantos to steal the rings right after you leave. I like the original story development in its own way because it actually establishes that Gonska can change his entire appearance before he next does it with Prime Minister Rom in the plot to assassinate the King of Riven. But I think this is overall a good change because with Sazantos being such a central figure in the story, it just makes sense to introduce the real him as early as possible. Also, this isn't really a story change, but I love that it's sunset on the Isle of Ursa now instead of just broad daylight. The vibes are just better, man, I don't know. Anyway, this next scene where Sazantos and the Chosen One meet with Pardis is completely new to Zero. It's the first instance in which the game acknowledges how weird it is that Sazantos wasn't chosen by the ring despite being the Flame Guard, which to my recollection is never once mentioned at any point in Champions of the Continent, so yeah, good change. This one also isn't a story change per se, but Gimmel's sprite got a huge glow up in Zero. In the mobile game, he has this tiny little battle sprite that makes him look like a common enemy despite not only being a main story chapter boss, but also being a recurring character who goes on to sacrifice himself in Bestower of Power. My boy deserves a sprite that takes up half the room. Now here's a change that's a bit more substantial. In Chapter 6 of Zero, you have to deliver Alaune's letter of accusation directly to the Pontiff in Flamesgrace, which you visit for the first time here. However, in the original story, you just deliver it to some random guy in Emberglow. You don't even visit Flamesgrace until the prologue of Bestower of Fame. Also, this is super random, but I noticed that Seraphina's theme plays here when you visit for the first time despite her not being here. A lot of people mistake her theme for some kind of general church theme in this game, but the song otherwise only plays in the 2 scenes Seraphina appears in Master of Power, and then in this church from the start to the end of Bestower of Fame, and it never plays again here after you defeat Seraphina. It's just a nitpick, but yeah. The last change I want to mention before we move on to the Bestower arcs is that Signa is introduced earlier than she is in the mobile game. She was originally introduced at the end of Bestower of Power Chapter 2, so I like that they moved her introduction over to just before the Bestower arc starts since she, much like Sazantos, is a major story villain later on. Speaking of Bestower of Power, we're talking about Bestower of Power now. In Chapter 2 and Zero, after Eltrix tells Alaune to leave, Alaune talks to Eltrix's subordinates, and they immediately agree to take her to Eltrix for another meeting. But in the mobile game story, they don't immediately agree. Instead, they make you prove you're trustworthy first by collecting 3 Grandport medals from various NPCs around the town. It's pretty obvious they removed this for pacing purposes, though it is a bit jarring how quickly Eltrix's subordinates go against her request despite them having no good reason to trust Alaune at this point in Zero. Moving on to the Chapter 3 dungeon, the whole Middle Sea dungeon is notably different in Zero, since the Middle Sea is now an area you can explore outside of Bestower of Power. In Champions of the Continent, the Middle Sea was just a dungeon for this specific chapter and wasn't a place you could freely explore like you can now in Zero. The Champions of the Continent version had one-way currents and a bunch of miniature islands you could visit to get a few chests and fight some elites, but now those islands are exclusive to the overworld version of the Middle Sea in Zero, rather than the Bestower of Power Chapter 3 version. Champions of the Continent's version of Middle Sea also had a Kate Island like the Isle of Sages, which is now a part of the Outer Sea in Zero. Okay, this one definitely doesn't count as a story change, but this caught my eye a few times during Zero, so I'm gonna bring it up. I noticed that they went for a more sunset-y lighting for Bestower of Power Chapter 3, while it mostly took place in broad daylight in Champions of the Continent up until the Tatlock fight. However, they used the sunset lighting for the ships every time they appear in cutscenes at all, which includes the parts before the characters actually go to the Middle Sea, like when we first see Eltrix's ship in Chapter 2. So as a result, we get these weird looking scenes where we see sunset lighting for one moment, but then it immediately cuts to the characters in broad daylight right afterward, and I just think that's funny. One other significant gameplay change here is that Richard helps you fight Tatlock in her second phase now, but no one helps you at all in the mobile game. It is pretty funny how all these characters like Alaune, Richard, Krauser, and even Marianne were supposedly here, but not a single one of them actually helped you fight Tatlock before. And now for Bestower of Fame. They made this dude in the prologue look like a cleric now instead of a Scarlet Wing before he reveals himself to be a Black Crimson member. Why is this important, you ask? It's not, but now you know. In Chapter 1 of Bestower of Fame, they made Sazantos about 1% more relevant here by having him be present during the Bishop Tarset interrogation, the part where we get the key to the confessional from Rinyu, and the whole scene in the confessional itself. In Champions of the Continent, he's off doing his own investigation at this point, which is how he learns about the secret passage in the confessional in the first place, and he only shows up after the others finish reading Misa's letter. I think they made this change out of necessity because Sazantos is in your party at this point in the game, so it wouldn't make sense for him to be elsewhere if he's supposed to be in your party. They did some real wacky things with the dungeons in Bestower of Fame though. In Chapter 2's dungeon, you can just skip past half the dungeon by walking across the bridge, but in Champions of the Continent, the bridge is torn down, so you have to explore the whole dungeon. I can only assume they made the dungeon easier and shorter because it was one of the most bizarrely designed dungeons in Champions of the Continent. And then in the Forbidden Temple in Chapter 3, they removed a couple rooms completely, which leaves the dungeon feeling a bit short. I don't like this change because I thought those rooms were interesting since they introduced the crystal switch puzzles that started to appear more in later dungeons. The boss fight against Black is notably the one fight from Champions of the Continent where they actually removed a helper character from the fight. In the mobile game, Sazantos helps you from the back, but now you're required to put him in your party for this fight. Seems like another change made out of necessity since he's playable at this point in the game. Lastly, this final scene with Sazantos looking out of the Flamesgrace Cathedral is new, as is the fin screen that accompanies it. It used to feature both Rinyu and Sazantos after their conversation about Graham Crossford, but Rinyu got shafted in Zero in favor of just Sazantos. Oh well. And finally, we arrive at Bestower of All. This arc has an absolutely insane amount of changes, so let's just get started. First of all, they gave Finis a new design. This guy Nomos wasn't in the mobile game at all, and Finis just had a less memorable guy in a white hood design. I mean, it wasn't bad, but I prefer this new design where you can actually see his face. Another small difference is that after Sazantos' betrayal in the prologue, the protagonist uses their ring to run through the accursed flames to try and fight Sazantos, which definitely did not happen in Champions of the Continent. I wasn't going to mention this since it's so minor of a change, but then the protagonist did it a second time in Chapter 6, and at that point I figured I had to bring it up because it feels significant somehow. In Chapter 2, after Bargello goes back to Valor, the protagonist similarly goes back to Wishvale and has a conversation with Stia before deciding to visit Bargello of their own accord to see how he's doing. But in Champions of the Continent, it's actually Alaune who tells the Chosen One to check in on Bargello. I always thought it was weird that Alaune would say, it's his choice, he can do what he wants, and then tell you to check up on him immediately after that conversation, so I'm glad they made this change. Next, in Chapter 3, there's this one sentence said by Elrica that's always rubbed me the wrong way in Champions of the Continent. After rewatching her own execution in Champions of the Continent, she states that she died accomplishing nothing, which obviously isn't true. It literally contradicts her final words, that which I fought to protect will live on after me. They changed this line completely in Zero, and once again, I'm really glad they did. I mean, I thought I was the only one who had that problem, but if they changed this line, I mean, they clearly knew it was an issue. In Chapter 4, this interaction between Tatlock and Rondo is new, as is her subsequent almost betrayal later on in that same chapter before Bargello stops her. I mean, this doesn't happen at all in Champions of the Continent, but it does seem in character for her to at least put up a little bit of a fight before joining the good side. Also, speaking of Chapter 4, let's talk about its dungeon, Hornburg Castle. If you've only played 0, then you might have noticed some areas that almost look like you can explore them, but they're just out of reach. The reason for that is that you can actually explore them in Champions of the Continent, but they shortened this dungeon a whole lot in this version. There's even a whole east wing off of the first room that they removed entirely in 0 as well. In Chapter 5 of 0, there's 8 diary entries to be found in the Gate of Finis, 3 of which are from dead Wishvale residents, those being Usia, Yaya, and Lavore. These actually replace 3 different parts of Sazantos' journal in Champions of the Continent, which talk about some events that led him down the path he took. I recommend looking them up and reading them if you're interested. Before you can actually start Chapter 6 in Champions of the Continent, you actually have to purify a certain number of souls in Hell to weaken a dark barrier that Sazantos created in the Gate of Finis. There's various NPCs throughout Hell that can be purified by meeting specific conditions, which lets those NPCs, like my goat the Starved Child in the Hell version of Castle Edoras, move on from Hell and get a happy ending. Unfortunately, you can't do this in 0, so sucks to be that starved kid, I guess. Interestingly, we do see this very same barrier appear at the end of Chapter 5 and 0, but it gets dispelled on its own at some point off screen before Chapter 6. Weird that they kept it in if we weren't going to have to do anything with it and it was just going to disappear on its own. This next one is just funny to me. After you defeat Herminia in 0, she says, "How chivalrous of you," to Bargello, which is a fine, mostly unremarkable line. However, in Champions of the Continent, her last words are, this? Yeah. It's just a weird as hell line that I'm not particularly gonna miss. Maybe someone will, but not me so much. Also in Chapter 6, there are 2 journals that you can find, in Champions of the Continent specifically. First is Faramea's journal, which was removed in 0 entirely. She has a new journal entry in the Gate of Orsa now, but it's completely different. The other journal is Signa's journal, which was also moved to the Gate of Orsa, but its content remains unchanged and now unlocks travel to Agapeia. The flashback of this part of Sazantos' backstory in Chapter 6 before you fight him is a bit different from how it is in the mobile game, as it shows some scenes that foreshadow Chapter 7. And we'll get to Chapter 7 in a second, so just keep that in mind. After the fight with Sazantos in the Gate of Finis, the Chosen One returns to Wishvale and finds out that no one recognizes them. In Champions of the Continent, the protagonist decides to go to Valor for some reason, and that's how they find out that no one remembers them. It's a minor change, but a welcome one given the new Wishvale story. Okay, so Chapter 7. This is the single biggest change in the story because nearly the entire thing is different. To recap, in 0, you go to the Flamebringer Shrine and see a vision of Sazantos at the Cathedral of Ash, finding out about what happened with Faramea before he starts killing everyone. The boss fight is Cardinal Telegraph, who is basically a scripted win for the player. Well, guess what? In Champions of the Continent, almost none of this happens. The Cathedral of Ash is new to 0, Telegraph and these other characters are new to 0. The only thing that's the same is the Flamebringer Shrine setting. In Champions of the Continent, you visit the Isle of Orsa, then go to Agapeia, and then go to the Flamebringer Shrine. This is a full dungeon with some interesting puzzles across 4 rooms. There's one room that's a giant maze with crystal switches that turn parts of the floor, a room where you solve some murder mystery logic puzzles involving characters that represent each of the 13 gods. There's this maze-like room where you have to fall off a ton of ledges, and this room where you perform a miniature version of the kindling from Octopath Traveler 1. After each room you complete, you get a cutscene with a different Guardian of Light character who doesn't remember the player or Sazantos at this point in the story, and a few of them are anticipating Elaune's child since she's pregnant now. The whole chapter ends with a very difficult fight against Elfric, who has his own boss battle theme. But in 0, they removed the entire dungeon, removed the Elfric boss fight music, and replaced it with the regular Those Who Govern boss fight music. Why they changed it, I still don't know. And they removed the cutscenes that built up a lot better to Elaune giving birth. On top of that, they demoted Agapeia and the Elfric boss fight to a side quest instead of main story content. I'm very conflicted on how I feel about it. It's probably a good thing that Sazantos is getting more screen time at least, but I really do miss the stuff they removed. The build-up in 0 to Elaune giving birth is practically non-existent, so it just feels random and shoehorned in without the context provided by some of those removed cutscenes. Plus, the Shrine of the Flamebringer was one of the most interesting dungeons in Champions of the Continent, and the boss music went pretty hard too. And finally, we arrive at Chapter 8. When you first get to the Gate of Orsa in 0, Sazantos takes you to his perfect world immediately, but in the mobile game, this perfect world part happens right before the final boss fight, after you've already completed the dungeon. It's probably better this way for pacing reasons. The perfect world he shows the player takes place entirely in Wishvale, but in the original story, you actually get to revisit the first 3 towns in the game, those being Valor, Emberglow, and Theatropolis. It ends with a pretty emotional scene where you have to tell your loved ones to their faces that you're rejecting the ideal world they want to stay in. Every scene is different to how it plays out in Zero, so I'd highly recommend looking up a video of it online if you've only played Zero. If you have a favorite character in the main story, they definitely got more screen time here. Unless your favorites are Pardis or Catwalk, because neither of them appears during this sequence for whatever reason. Just as a side note, my one hope for Zero was that they'd give Seraphina more screen time, but they literally gave her less screen time by removing the 2 cutscenes that involve her. I'm still salty and I'm never gonna shut up about it. The Gate of Orsa dungeon itself is different, with the sea and sky areas being completely restructured. In Zero, you have to go in order of sea to sands to sky, while in Champions of the Continent, you can do them in any order. Also, this new journal entry from Lilac appears in the sea area, which I can only assume they added since Orgaldera is the true final boss now, and they wanted to make it feel more connected. I don't really have anything else to say about it, but yeah, it's unique to Zero. When you beat the final boss in Zero, it just kinda dies like a normal enemy, but in Champions of the Continent, it had this really sick animation. Why they removed this, I genuinely have no clue. It was iconic and one of the things I was looking forward to most about the fight, but yeah, I don't know. For whatever reason, they just decided it just looks terrible, I guess, and so it's just gone now. I don't even know. This whole scene here with Sazantos and Faramea in their house is entirely new as well. Kind of an interesting thing to add. They gave Faramea a lot more screen time in general since they added this new lore about her being implied to be the mother of both the main character and Signa, which wasn't a thing at all in Champions of the Continent. I don't think Faramea was even mentioned past Chapter 6 in Champions of the Continent. The dialogue from Sazantos during the Bestower of All fight is also new. The original fight had some last-minute appearances from the Guardians of Light, including Rinyu, who help you out at the end. They presumably removed this because you fight with them in your party in Zero, so it wouldn't really make much sense. Lastly, and probably the single biggest change in all of Zero, is the all-new true ending with the Orgaldera fight. Plus, Sazantos lives after that fight, while he simply dies after the Sazantos fight in Champions of the Continent. Pretty wild that they gave him a redemption arc after everything on top of him surviving, but I'm not against it. I think it was well enough written. I was genuinely shocked though when it hit me that he was actually going to survive because I hadn't been spoiled on that at all and never would have guessed that they'd even let him live after everything. Oh, and one other thing of note is that there's also an epilogue in Champions of the Continent that's gone from Zero now, which once again involves visiting all of the Champions of Light with Rondo before he becomes the next Flame Guard. He even visits Rinyu's grave, which is pretty sweet. Since Sazantos lives in Zero though, I guess they had no choice but to change this. I guess the Octopath Traveler Zero version of Rondo is unfortunately doomed to be a simple Knight Ardent forever. Anyway, that's all the main story changes I could find, outside of some especially minor ones, like Fina facing a different way in this one scene than she does in Champions of the Continent. That counts as more screen time, right? Right? Please just let me have this. That aside, I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun playing through the game and finding all of these random differences too. I think they did a good job overall at adapting my favorite mobile game to a console, even if it isn't perfect. I'm sure I missed some changes by the way, so if there's any you thought were interesting that I didn't mention, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. I will read them because I care way too much about this series. Oh, and also, here's my socials. I can't just pass up an opportunity to plug them, so there they are. Alright, see y'all later.